Welcome back, Quick Brain. Your question for today is why should you drop acid? And this is kind of a very provocative title. This is the Quick Brain Show, all for busy people who want to learn faster, have greater brain health, and really live your limitless life. And on our show today, we have Dr. David Perlmutter. He's an MD, board certified neurologist, and five-time New York Times bestselling author. I have one of your previous books. I love this book, Brainwash,
Oh, thank
David.
you. That is
And
special book for me because I wrote it with my son, our son. So very
and
special.
obviously, Brain, is iconic. Your new book is called Drop Acid, and that's the inspiration for the opening question. So why should people, our audience here, why should they be concerned about acid, and why should they be dropping it?
So let's make it clear right from the
Clear.
get-go that we're talking about a specific type of acid in the body called uric acid that needs to be generally in most people lowered. Why? Because this uric acid is a powerful destructive signal to our metabolism. It's telling the body that we may not have food in the future. We need to make fat, store fat, raise our blood pressure, raise our blood sugar as a signal, a metabolic signal. And generally, these days, that signal is in the on position all the time. So that's the acid that we're looking for people to understand and certainly gain control over, rein it in if they want to get rid of this metabolic mayhem that is so pervasive in our, in the Western world. Here in America, 88% of adults has at least one component of what is called the metabolic syndrome, meaning high blood pressure, increased body fat, high blood sugar, dyslipidemia, problems with cholesterol and triglycerides. So that means that only 1 in 8 American adults is metabolically intact. And now that we've got this connection to uric acid, that the pieces of that puzzle have fallen into place, it has become a really powerful new tool for us to again regain metabolic health and help us live a longer and healthier life.
And how is this uric acid? Two questions then. How is it affecting the brain specifically, our brain health, our ability for us to mentally perform? And then where are the big culprits? What are the big contributors
Sure.
to
Well, let's take
uric acid?
question one first. And, the biggest issues that lead to a dysfunctional brain mechanistically are things like inflammation, elevated blood sugar, and certainly the action of chemicals called free radicals or what we call oxidative stress. All three of those are powerfully amplified when uric acid is elevated. So, your work over the years has been to give us the tools so that we can work the brain, we can figure out ways of improving our memory, and utilize our understanding, for example, of how memories are stored and how they're retrieved. But fundamentally, all of that depends on the good stuff, right? That the brain substance has to be there and connected up in such a way that you can leverage the tools that you've been talking about for so long. And again, those are the big threats to destructive threats to the brain. What makes a good brain go bad? And I've been talking about this for quite some time, especially as it relates to inflammation. We know that the major neurodegenerative conditions that we so fear, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, etc., are at their root inflammatory disorders. So we've really got to do everything we can to rein in inflammation. Now we have a new tool for that, and that is controlling our uric acid. Testing our uric acid, something you can do at home, and then using various tools to help us bring it down. Takes me to your second question. That is, where in the heck is it coming from? And actually, in your body, uric acid is only made from three things: the metabolism or the breakdown of something called purines. Purines are the breakdown products of the very DNA and RNA that's found in certain foods. Alcohol, that's pretty straightforward. But the biggest player of all today is the unique sugar called fructose. So, fructose is metabolized directly into uric acid. Higher dietary fructose, higher uric acid, higher inflammation, bad for the brain.
And is that, what does that leave in terms of people's stance on fruit, eating
Well,
a
that's
high
a great
fruit
question
diet?
because actually that's what the name means. Fructose means fruct sugar is where it was from derived from. And the epidemiology looks at that and shows us that actual consumption of fruit is associated with a slightly lower uric acid. So what I'm saying today is don't cut out the fruit.
Okay.
But two things are important. You don't want to go overboard. You know, an apple a day keeps the doctor away. 5 apples a day, and the doctor you will pay. Meaning that, you know, have some fruit. That's totally fine. Fruit has in it something. First of all, the fructose content of an apple is not that great. It's nowhere in comparison to what you get by drinking a soda or drinking a glass of fruit juice, for example. Two things. Number one, it's not a lot of fructose in comparison. Number two, the release of that fructose in your system is much slower when you're eating fruit because of the fiber. You excrete more uric acid because of the vitamin C, and you block the production of uric acid because a lot of fruit contains a certain bioflavonoid called quercetin. That'll lead us to talking about some unique supplements that can help us lower the uric acid. But it doesn't mean that other sources of free fructose therefore are off the hook. So the powerful blast of fructose that your body gets from drinking fruit juice is something to consider, and certainly, you know, soda. And when you take a step back and recognize that 60% or more of the packaged foods in the grocery store, basically those that carry a barcode, have added sweetener today in our country. Why? Because we like sweet. We're deeply programmed to seek out sweet as a survival mechanism. It tells the body by consuming that fructose that winter is coming. Make fat, store fat, lock it up, make blood sugar, raise the blood pressure. All of these things served our ancestors, not just our paleo ancestors, but our primate ancestors even, to survive. So we all have a sweet tooth. We all gravitate towards sweet, and don't think food manufacturers don't know that. Food manufacturers, that's a bit of an oxymoron. You don't manufacture food, in my opinion, nonetheless. So, you know, there are plenty of hidden sources and hidden names for this fructose that creeps into our diets, stimulates our bodies to make uric acid as a survival mechanism. And that relates back to question one: what does it do? It amplifies inflammation. And I think the brain is least able to cope with inflammation of really any organ in the body.
You mentioned testing. I just want to go back to that. How easy is it for our listeners to be able to measure the level of uric acid in their body?
Well, typically it's something any doctor can do. It's part of your annual blood work. But the great news is you can go out or online and buy a home uric acid monitor and test your own uric acid, just like you might test your blood sugar. My recent test is, here's my level. There's my monitor,
Mhm.
4.7. And really, what our target is anything under 5.5. And that is associated with then not increasing your risk for these all sorts of cardiometabolic issues. You know, the so-called normal level that your laboratory might tell you is 7, way too high for two reasons. Number one, that is the level above which you're at increased risk for gout. So it doesn't really relate to what you and I are talking about right now. And number two, I think that your podcast listeners are not so interested in normal values, but what's optimal,
Right.
what's really the best for me. I want to be right, you know, in the middle of that bell curve. And so anything under 5.5 is what we're targeting, milligrams per deciliter. And you know, once you get above 7, one study, a Japanese study, looked at 90,000 people, 42,000 men, 48,000 women, and followed them over an 8-year period of time. And those
Wow.
individuals who had the higher levels of uric acid had a 16% increased risk for what's called all-cause mortality. That means ending up dead for whatever reason. They had a
Wow.
39% increased risk for death from cardiovascular disease and a 35% increased risk of death from stroke. Obviously, that involves the brain. A more recent study, also out of Japan, followed 1,600 people over 12 years and looked at them every 2 years doing an examination of how well their brains are working. And they found that in the group with the uric acid level above 7, that their risk for dementia was increased by 80%. The risk for specifically Alzheimer's increased by 55%. And the risk for what is called mixed dementia or vascular dementia was increased 166%. That's it's a correlation study. It's not it didn't say the uric acid is causing that, but
Right.
now that we know what uric acid is doing in human physiology, it makes those types of numbers very understandable by amplifying inflammation, by increasing the blood pressure, by turning on glucose production. We know there's a direct relationship between blood sugar elevation and risk for Alzheimer's, as a matter of fact, published in the New England Journal of Medicine, 2013. That's old news already. So it's really all about, again, these are metabolic markers. We have the tools to measure them at home. Anybody can do it. And we've got simple tools now to help you bring your uric acid levels under control and finally gain control of things like that little bit of extra body fat that you're wanting to get rid of, or maybe helping reduce your dependence on blood pressure medication or diabetes medication by getting that uric acid level lower.
Hmm. Now, these numbers aren't small. I mean, these numbers you're quoting from the studies in terms of the number of subjects, and also when we're talking about Alzheimer's, dementia, stroke, I mean, they're not minor. So we talked about things to avoid, whether it's the fruit juices, the sodas, most things with a barcode. And you mentioned also that there are supplements that could help mitigate the effects. I know you go into it a lot more in this book, which I will definitely recommend to put links for in
Again,
the show
drop
notes.
acid. That's why we're here today, right? Um, but the reality is that a lot of the experimental work done here in America, also in Turkey and Japan, have looked at the interventions to lower uric acid by using gout drugs, primarily one that we know dramatically lowers uric acid called allopurinol. Well, it turns out that quercetin is on par with allopurinol in terms of its effectiveness in dropping that uric acid. It actually targets an enzyme that is involved in making a uric acid called xanthine oxidase, for anyone who is going to take the quiz following our time together today.
Hmm.
But the point is, it works mechanistically just like the drug. And one study out of Oxford looked at 22, not a large subject group, but 22 young men with elevated uric acid, put them on 500 milligrams of quercetin, and their uric acid levels fell 8% in 2 weeks. 8% is really important. That's a big drop in uric acid in just 2 weeks. So quercetin, 500 milligrams a day is what I recommend. That's a health food store or an online item. You don't need a prescription for it. There is another bioflavonoid that goes by the name of luteolin, Luteolin, acts similarly and actually is very effective. That dosage would be about 100 milligrams a day. We also know that DHA, which is an omega-3 found in things like fish oil, though there are vegetarian sources. Boy, that's got to be on the list because it very much ameliorates some of the downsides of fructose consumption. It doesn't mean, therefore, taking a lot of DHA allows you to eat all the fructose you want, but some of the liver side effects, for example, are significantly tempered, at least in the laboratory models, as it relates to that relationship then between what fructose can do and having high DHA on board. Certainly, DHA, because it turns on neurogenesis, something you've talked about over the years, and neuroplasticity is definitely one of the biggies to have on board. Specifically as it relates to the brain. And DHA does what? It targets inflammation. It is a natural, what is called COX-2 inhibitor. There are drugs that are COX-2 inhibitors. DHA does the same thing. It's why fish is brain food. It's why taking a high quality fish oil supplement is really something we talk about, especially as it relates to the brain.
Now, is it important in terms of timing that people take their DHA with foods that could potentially elevate their level of uric acid? Is that important?
No, I think the more important reason to take DHA with food is because it's fat.
Okay.
And once you're having a meal that likely will have fat in it, especially if you're adding a lot of olive oil, which I recommend, then the mechanisms for fat absorption are amped up, and you'll be much more able to absorb DHA, get it into your system where then it can do its magic. Not just in terms of helping form good cell membranes in the brain and throughout the body, but then also this turning on of the genes to make this BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, that's a very powerful nutrient, or let's say we call it a trophic hormone, but like it helps brain cells grow and helps them connect. And who's not going to want that?
Brain-derived neurotropic factors is definitely a good thing. So, in a moment, I want to ask you what a typical diet is for you and your family in a typical day. Before we do, I highly recommend, our audience, they're readers, they're avid readers. They believe that you read so you could succeed. If someone has decades of experience like you do, and you put it into a book, in your case, multiple books, and someone gets to sit down in a few days and read that book, they could download decades of knowledge in days. Why did you write this book, and why is it important for people to look into it?
Well, over the years, let me take you back just a bit. I started off 35 years ago practicing very mainstream neurology, drugs for this and that, treating headaches, no treatment for Alzheimer's, so that didn't happen, but treating the symptoms of Parkinson's, and generally realized that what neurology, or for me, seemed like I was doing was treating symptoms. I was treating the smoke and ignoring the fire. And over time, I learned that there was plenty of literature out there that showed that, we can attack these underlying mechanisms, these metabolic issues that are setting the stage for the brain to deteriorate, and not just the brain, but the entire body. That, as we mentioned earlier, these causes of the number one cause of death on our planet, these chronic degenerative conditions, not just the brain, but the heart, diabetes, cancer, are at their root metabolic issues. So I've been really fixated on metabolic health. Then, upon really diving deeply into the science of uric acid, realize this is a powerful new tool for us. People get that they need to sleep. They get that, limiting their refined carbohydrates. Not that they fully get it. Everybody can do a little more work in those areas. But now we have a new tool. We realize how so many of the things that we've been talking about for years, what is the mechanism by which they're really messing us up? They're leading to this metabolic mayhem. I mean, the literature on fructose came out in 1970, published in the journal The Lancet, saying, hey, fructose consumption is related to gaining weight, it's related to higher blood pressure and elevated blood sugar, if not diabetes. But we didn't know how it happened. Now we know that the metabolism of fructose leads to uric acid, and that is the signaling messenger. That's telling the body, prepare for winter. And that's what happened to our ancestors. They would eat the ripened blueberries in the late summer and the early fall, and that fructose would prepare them so they could survive during times of scarcity of food, caloric scarcity. Those who made more uric acid would survive. And in fact, that's a suite of sweet, not that sweet, a group of mutations that took place somewhere around 14 million years ago in our primate ancestors, and allowed those to survive. They lost the ability to break down uric acid, the uricase mutation that's been talked about in Scientific American. They lost the ability to break it down, so it accumulates in their bodies. So your uric acid, my uric acid, human uric acid is 4 to 5 times higher that of other mammals, because it was a good thing. Having higher blood pressure, making body fat, raising your blood sugar to power your brain, Those were good things in the day. But in today's world, when we're powering up this signaling mechanism day and night, 365, it's what we call an evolutionary environmental mismatch. And I
Mm.
wrote my first article about this 50 years ago in the Miami Herald when I was 16 years old. And I asked the question at the end of that article. I said, what are we to do today? What about us with this outdated machinery, our bodies, meaning that we're not going to have, adaptation and genetic selection isn't going to happen quickly enough for us who are alive today. We can't change the evolutionary part of that, but we sure as heck can change the environmental part, the influences on our physiology that have to do with our foods, our the amount of sleep that we get,
Right.
the not just our foods as it relates to fructose and alcohol and purines, but incredibly, we know that salt consumption, everybody's down on salt consumption with good reason. We know that eating salt relates to obesity, relates to diabetes, and certainly relates to higher blood pressure, right? We've heard about that for years, but we never knew why. We never knew how it happened. And now we know that increasing your salt consumption turns on the body's own endogenous production of fructose. So it's not just the fructose that you're going
Mm.
to encounter by going to the grocery store, it's how you stimulate or not your body's own production of fructose. And that happens when your salt level goes up by eating a lot of salt, or you are hypoxic, meaning your blood oxygen saturation is lower. Now, that doesn't mean climbing K2. That might mean having something which is really common called sleep apnea. When you have sleep apnea, you don't breathe as well as you should during sleep. What happens? You're turning on your body's production of fruit sugar that becomes uric acid that even continues to amplify the reason that you may have sleep apnea in the first place, meaning obesity. So that gets worse and worse with time. So it is all about a wearable device to determine how well you're sleeping. How long are you sleeping? What is the quality of your sleep?
Mm.
And then also knowing what is your uric acid level. Go to the doctor, call the doctor's office from last year. What was it then? Or by all means, go online and buy a monitor and learn about this really exciting new tool that we have. And again, frankly, here in America, we're a little bit behind compared to other countries. Uh, Japan, for example, they are marketing purine-free beer because purines raise uric acid and alcohol raises uric acid. So now you can drink alcohol in the beer or even beer without alcohol, but they've taken the purines out. Why did they do that? Because purines become uric acid. It's a powerful metabolic threat.
Mm. I like to emphasize what you're talking about in terms of the evolution of our body, which includes our brain and our environment. Going from survive what was helping us to survive certainly today won't help us to be able to thrive. In terms of talking about their families and themselves, what can I ask you the next? Like, what is a typical day for in terms of your meals throughout the day? When do you start eating generally? And it's not just what you eat; it's when you're eating, how you're eating, and but
That's so
I'm curious
important.
what
And
also falls in
yeah,
that. Yeah, what's on your plate?
you bet. So I don't eat till about at least noon, but oftentimes later. Yesterday it was 3:30 in the afternoon when I finally got around to it, and I must admit that the longer I do that, the less hungry I get, and frankly, by 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I'm still not hungry, but I know that my window of eating is open, so I better eat something. Um, I exercise in the morning. I think there's a lot of literature coming out now saying that by and large, it might be better in the afternoon, but my habit has always been to run in the morning. So I do that. Um, we try to finish dinner no later than about 7 p.m. It may be later, but generally not. There are social circumstances whereby you're going to eat later, but I try to influence whatever that social situation is to say, hey, look, I'm really into eating earlier because I don't sleep well if I eat late. I sleep okay even if I do, but let people have a little concern
Right.
for you is always a good thing. And I generally can do 2 meals a day and can easily do fine on 1 meal a day. And I'm not saying everybody needs to do that, but I will indicate that the notion of 3 meals a day is a construct that seems to have begun around the time of the Industrial Revolution, where people would work all day and have to have a break. Certainly, our hunter-gatherer forebears didn't stop in the middle of the day when they were chasing the wildebeest to have a lunch break. So there's nothing, I think, in our genome and in our circadian rhythm that would indicate we need 3 meals a day. But I do try to compress my food consumption into a narrower window, whether it's 10 hours or 8 hours. And that has been given the moniker by Dr. Sachin Panda of time restricted eating. And I think when you look at his research and the research of others, there is a huge metabolic benefit from eating in that way as it relates to honoring your body's chronobiology, letting your body do what it needs to do at the right time, letting it digest when it needs to digest, and then letting it repair and divert its attention away from digestion and do the repair that we so desperately need. And interestingly, getting back to our uric acid story, uric acid elevation favors a pathway that takes us away from this notion of digesting damaged tissue, the autophagy pathway. And really, that's really very, very important. So it really favors the body making new tissue, building body fat, and takes us away from a pathway many of your viewers may have heard of called AMP kinase, the AMPK pathway. We want that to be active as much as we can. That's the pathway that says the hunting is good, meaning we don't need to make fat. We don't need to store fat. We don't need to raise the blood pressure and raise the blood sugar because we've got plenty of food. When we compromise AMP kinase, then the body thinks it needs to store energy and make fat and store a resource for water because we might not be able to find water. And how do we do that? Body fat. Who knew? If you look at a camel, great example for me is the camel walks across the desert for days or weeks, whatever it is, and doesn't drink. And how does it do that? Well, what's the unique feature of the camel's body? It has a hump. And if you took a look inside the hump, what would you see? Fat.
Mm.
Fat, when we burn it for energy, becomes carbon dioxide, which we exhale, and metabolic water. So fat is a storage depot for calories. Yeah, we get that, but it's also how the body can make water. It's why prior to its epic 1,000-mile journey, the hummingbird is 40% by weight body fat. Think about that. The hummingbird is a fat animal, and it taps into that fat resource to make energy, of course, but also water. Whales don't find springs on the bottom of the ocean. They're constantly making free metabolic water from their immense quantities of body fat that they make and store. Well, we don't need to do that. We don't need to store body fat as a resource for water. And that's why we don't need to keep activating this production of uric acid. Uric acid is the signal telling us that winter is coming and we might not have food and we might not have water. We don't need to engage that any longer. Now we have the tools to understand it. We
Mm.
understand the mechanisms and we know how we can bring it under control.
So we talked about when you eat, and we and time restricted, intermittent fasting, fuel for your brain, and why you're actually eating and how you're eating. What specifically, if I may ask, are some of your favorite foods on the other side of the
Well,
conversation?
today I'll just tell you, I ate an entire avocado.
Hmm.
And in that avocado, which I love because when you cut it in half and take the pit out, it's like a little swimming pool, and I fill that with extra virgin olive oil. I used to salt it, but I don't salt it anymore. I might use some ground pepper. I don't use salt anymore. I eat a lot of vegetables, and we have great resources where I live. We get a box delivered every week that's from a local farm. So a lot of fiber-rich vegetables. I'm very much still involved in microbiome research and recognize that dietary fiber is so underrated but critical for the health of our gut bacteria. I eat fish. I will eat some grass-fed beef on occasion. I eat some chicken. I eat minimal amounts of other shellfish like scallops and mussels, for example. They can bump up the uric acid. My levels of uric acid are good. I'm keeping them under control. I use a continuous glucose monitor, and I'm
Mhm.
very happy with where my blood sugars are in the low 80s as an average. Um, I do bottom out a little bit about 3 o'clock in the morning. I don't know why, down to about 58. But and I also measure, I use an Aura ring to measure the quality and quantity of my sleep. So I'm not the biggest biohacker in the world, but I'm able to determine how my lifestyles choices are affecting the measurable parameters that I think are important. What is the effect of my food on my blood sugar? What is the effect of timing of my exercise, my sleep quality on my blood sugar, on my uric acid level, and certainly on the parameters of sleep. These are hugely valuable. And I am always encouraging people to get to know those values because generally mainstream medicine is there to respond to things that are abnormal. And there was an interesting op-ed in the Journal of the American Medical Association several months ago that asked the question, should continuous glucose monitors be made available for non-diabetics? And the answer they came up with was no, because they'll make them neurotic and they don't need it because their blood sugars are okay. And you could tell by my facial expression, was not pleased with that response because look, if you reserve that information for people who are already diabetic, then it doesn't help people not get there in the first place. And that's the goal, is to keep people healthy. You know, John Kennedy said in his inaugural address that the time to fix the roof is when the sun is shining. And I'm all about that. You know, I'm all about giving people the tools to stay out of the doghouse, keep themselves healthy, and they're not going to then be dependent upon, the doctors to come up with some pulling out a magic trick from their box, the toolbox that'll help them with whatever that ailment may be. And, especially these days, we want to keep metabolic health in check. We know that those individuals who are having the worst outcome as it relates to COVID are those individuals who have metabolic issues, elevated blood pressure, increased body BMI, elevated blood sugar. These bode poorly for outcome as it relates to being hospitalized with COVID. And one big study just came out showing that if you enter the hospital, if uric acid level is elevated, you triple your risk for things like going on a ventilator, going into the ICU, or dying with an elevated uric acid. And I think that really crystallizes the role that it's playing in metabolism and how metabolism influences our ability to rein in the production of these inflammatory chemicals that we know are related to the so-called cytokine storm. Everybody's familiar with that term now. This overabundance of these cytokine inflammatory chemicals that bodes poorly for outcome as it relates to COVID infection. Well, guess what? There is also something, uh, we call it the cytokine drizzle, meaning, well, it's not this huge storm of raining down of these cytokines, but this low level but slight elevation of these inflammatory markers over time that strongly influences our risk for development of Alzheimer's, of coronary artery disease, of diabetes. We don't want that slight bump of inflammation chronically. And that's another important role of uric acid that, you and I touched upon a while ago.
Dr. Perlmutter, how do people get your new book, Drop Acid? Where can people best go to stay connected with you also as well?
It's everywhere. The URL for the book is dropacidbook.com. That
Mhm.
should be pretty straightforward.
Drop Acid book. And I encourage everybody here not only to go and get the book at your favorite retailer or local store, but take a screenshot of this and make sure you follow Dr. Perlmutter, tag him, tag myself on it so we get to see it, and tell us that you're up to this challenge. You know, that what's one simple step that you're going to take because of this conversation. Maybe
Absolutely.
it could be, getting the book. Maybe it's adding some avocado and some olive oil into your diet. Maybe it's the time restricted eating. Maybe it's something. There was this episode was such full of chock full of instruction and usable practices. Share that. I will repost because you're going to tag us in it. Some of my favorites, and I'll actually gift one copy of Drop Acid to our audience just as a thank you for sharing it. As always, in the show notes, jimkwik.com/notes, we'll put all the links and the highlights of this episode as well. And make sure you get this book because it is that important. You know, you mentioned the power of prevention, that when's the best time to plant a tree? It was 20 years ago. When's the second best time? It's today. And so get started. Don't leave this conversation without taking some kind of small, simple action. So you can take that knowledge and turn it into real power. Dr. Perlmutter, thank you so much for being on our show. And we
Thank you,
look forward to
Jim.
having.
I really appreciate it. And truthfully, I did have the opportunity to watch a couple of videos about your work before our time together today to get to know you a little bit, and it's phenomenal. And
Thank you.
I'm working on this from one end, and you are bringing incredible tools to bear for people on the other end in terms of performance, and I think it's terrific.
I always tell people, our listeners, they know this, but it's, there's two parts, and metaphorically, it could be like the hardware and the software. We teach more of the software, how to remember names, how to learn languages, how to focus, how to read faster, understand what you read, make good decisions, be more creative, innovate. But if you don't take care of the hardware, if that's full of the uric acid and the inflammation, everything, then, if you're not getting sleep, if you're not doing these things to take care of that, then you're not going to get the kind of results that you really desire and that you really deserve. So thank you
So true. Thank you.
thank you for your work.
Hi, Kwik Brain. It's your brain coach. I want to thank you so much for watching this video. 3 things to do. Number 1, make sure you share this, because when you teach something, you get to learn it twice. Update your learning so you can update other people's learning as well. Number 2, make sure you subscribe to this channel so you don't miss a thing, because if you miss a video, you miss a lot. And finally, make sure you hit that bell so you're notified and you find out when we put out the latest and the greatest. One extra thing, if you want really close attention, then text me. Here is my phone number, 310-299-9362. Did you remember that number? 310-299-9362. Shoot me a text and we'll stay in touch. Ask me your burning question. And I wish your days be full of lots of life, lots of love, lots of laughter, and always lots of learning. I'll see you in our next video.